Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this special session hosted by Metro Vancouver and the National Zero Waste Council. I'm Erica Johnson, host of CBC's National Investigative Consumer Program Marketplace, and it's my pleasure to be here moderating. It's wonderful to see such a great turnout on a Friday afternoon, no less, and a pretty packed room, so thank you so much for coming today. I think I was asked to take part in this event because our show recently produced a story on overpackaging of products, everything from food to toys to electronics, and how that generates 5 million tons of waste in our landfill every year in Canada. And as a mom of a young daughter, I have suffered through Christmas morning trying to break through toys and plastic clamshell and cardboard and a million twist ties, only to have my daughter then play with the packaging more than the actual gift. So I think it's something we can all relate to. How do we reduce not just overpackaging, but waste of all kinds? And in fact, the creation of waste is one of Canada's leading environmental and economic issues right now, the challenges. And today we're going to talk about some ways that we can address it and hopefully some solutions as well. Waste is not just a problem, it's in fact a much more fundamental issue, one that questions how we use resources, how we design, how we produce, how we use goods in an era of increasing resource scarcity. The National Zero Waste Council and others are working hard to address this issue, calling for collaborative action, calling for systemic change that addresses the factors that generate waste in the first place, uniting and scaling up efforts in waste prevention, as well as providing alternatives that move us away from the traditional take, make, dispose model. So we're going to discuss the challenges, but we'll also hear how embracing this shift can lead to opportunities for businesses, for governments, and as well for consumers. And we're going to hear how to get involved. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists today. Immediately to my right, your left, Shelley Carroll is a councillor with the City of Toronto and a director with the National Zero Waste Council. It's a cross-sector initiative that has a waste prevention agenda that they are moving forward in Canada. And she is here today representing the chair of the National Zero Waste Council. Welcome, Shelley.
Thank you. Hello, Erica.
Michael Gores is Executive Director with the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment, the primary minister-led intergovernmental forum for collective action on environmental issues on national and international concern, and he is an advisor to the National Zero Waste Council. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you.
Jamie Butterworth is Chief Executive of the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, a not-for-profit organization that is credited with promoting and advancing the move to what's called a circular economy in the UK and, in fact, globally. And we'll hear more about what a circular economy is and how you have achieved some victories. And last but not least, Nathalie St-Pierre is Vice President, Sustainability in Quebec for the Retail Council of Canada, an organization that represents the diverse needs of Canada's retailers. And Nathalie is also a board member with the National Zero Waste Council. Thank you all for coming and joining us today.
You bet.
As well in the audience, we have several other members of the National Zero Waste Council. If you could just raise your hand as I call your name. Renee Gratton is here today. And next to her, Christina Seidel, Brock McDonald, Alan Lynch, and David Ransom in the back. So thank you for joining us as well. I just want to quickly outline how today's session will unfold. Each panelist is going to have 5 minutes for introductory remarks, and then we're going to have a bit of a conversation. Following that, I'm going to open the floor for discussion from you. So you'll see 2 mics in the aisles. Please feel free. We really strongly encourage participation in today's discussion. We are here to hopefully hear your questions, resolve things, come up with creative solutions. I know a lot of you in the audience have a lot to contribute, so please bring them forward. Don't hesitate. We also are using something to include people not only who may not want to go up to the mics, but it's something called Poll Everywhere, which is easy to follow. The instructions are up on the screen. You go to your device's website, if you guys have phones or iPads in the audience, go to pollev.com/askNZWC for National Zero Waste Council. Very tricky. And then type your question or comment into the response area and click Submit Response. And your questions will come to us. And we'll try to get through as many of those questions with our panelists as we can. Any questions that we can't address during this forum will be addressed on the National Zero Waste Council website. And of course, if you want to tweet today, the hashtag is hashtag NZWC. And lastly, this session is being videotaped, and you can check it out later online at the Metro Vancouver website, www.metrovancouver.org, as well as at the National Zero Waste Council website, www.nzwc.ca. So now to tell us a little bit about the National Zero Waste Council and the role of local governments, I would like to hand the floor over to Shelley Carroll.
Well, thank you, Erica. First of all, if you're tweeting, don't forget the hashtag. My least favorite thing about being on a panel is I am now not tweeting. That is like asking me not to breathe. So put the hashtag in there so I can send them all to Toronto as soon as we're done. You said it's a little complicated to roll off the tongue NZWC. What we're hoping is that becomes, for this mixed group of stakeholders in the activity of dealing with waste, that it really does start to roll off the tongue, because it really creates change. And so that at every level of government, and at every level from retail to the producer to the raw materials at the very beginning of any process, that becomes the place you go to find out who's compiled the best communications, the best practices, and who's making the most impact at all of those levels, to make sure that we're collaborating on policy that we can all adhere to on a national level, and therefore make it easy to comply. We started having that discussion municipally from the advent of the first blue box. We're gonna have this blue box. Gee, there's a lot of things in it. If you get people to comply, now we have so much to process. And so it began from there. Gee, you can get a lot of things out of the residual waste stream. What if we started source separating organic materials out? What if we keep going until there's nothing left in the residual waste garbage can but a tennis racket, because that's hard to break down? We made those jokes. But while we were doing that, we were creating policy that really said, just got to do something about those producers. Let's have stewardship programs. Let's go to the provincial level and figure out a way to make someone else pick up the tab that is growing for us. Because in the beginning, recycling markets were even less predictable than they are now, and a real challenge. But at the same time, we know that the producer was looking at, well, now they're asking every year to change the mathematical formula for stewardship programs. How can we get around those municipalities? We finally came to the point a couple of years ago where we had a city like Metro Vancouver, and indeed the whole Federation of Canadian Municipalities, which is 2,500 member municipalities in Canada, talking about the same thing, but not collaborating in any way. And so you might well come up with a great idea, and it might fit whatever process you're using in your city, but you haven't talked to the other municipality, and they may be using another process at the end of their stream, but at the beginning of the stream, you're going to save money if there's less of it. At the beginning of the stream of stewardship as a producer, you're going to pay less money if there's less of it. So now we've got to go back to the practice of how do we produce the goods, and how do we teach people how to consume the goods in such a way that there's less of the waste and recycling residual to deal with. But collaborating means that eventually we're going to come up with things that it makes it easy for each of the municipal governments charged with the responsibility for waste, for waste to say, we can comply with that, so that if you're a national producer, you know you can comply in every province and in every municipality. We know that at the end, it may lead to asks of the federal government in the policy arena. If we're collaborating, if we're going as partners, not municipalities ask for something, food banks ask for something, stewardship program leaders ask for something. If we were all going together and saying, we've collaborated, this is what will get us there, so that Canada is no longer the worst of 17 major nations in terms of the volume of waste. Collaboration, we believe, is the way we're going to get real change in that arena. We can talk more about the membership, but it's really made up of that mixed membership that you see in the Globe Forum these 3 days.
Great. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, Shelley. Next up, Michael Gores. And Michael, if you could speak to the political imperative behind a zero waste agenda and why it needs to be a national conversation and perhaps some of the challenges behind that.
Absolutely. It's got to be a Canada-wide conversation, not just a national conversation. I think there's a critical distinction in there because most people think about national as actually meaning federal action. And this is a space, this is an area that involves so many participants, so many levels, so many orders of government, so many stakeholders that one government in and of itself won't have an effect. The political imperative is rooted in exactly what Shelley was articulating. And Canada's 17th on a list of 17. That was the Conference Board of Canada report that came out last year. One can argue about the methodology underlying that analysis, but whether we're 17th or 15th or 13th, it's a pretty shabby showing. According to the OECD, we're 8th out of a listing of 25. Is 8th out of 25 better than 17 out of 17? Pick your poison. The point is, we need to do better, and at a political level, the ministers, the politicians of this country at the federal, provincial, territorial level are genuinely seized off of this. The difficulty is it's such a massive problem and divided into so many different areas. Again, so many folks to be involved in it. How do you actually achieve progress? Pretty well every province in this country has got some kind of framework, strategy, policy statement about waste management. And they go about it in different ways, but the articulation is there. Some have targets, some don't have targets. Some have a variety of approaches that are very quantitative, others very qualitative. There's no consistency across the board there. When we're comparing across the country, we don't even have definitions on that are comparable so that we can compare Vancouver to Toronto, Alberta to Nova Scotia. So at a very basic level, we're still missing quite a bit of the building blocks. So it's pretty hard to have a long-term vision and a long-term action when you don't even have some of the basics in place. So what we're trying to do at an FPT level is work to build some of those building blocks. Obviously, we don't create it alone. It is very much about collaboration. CCME, for those who know anything about it, is fundamentally a collaborative organization, works on consensus, and only works in those things that are amenable to some kind of consensus. So the fact that waste management in this country is even on our agenda is a statement to just how important it is. Air quality is on our agenda because it's a critically important issue. Waste management is on our agenda because it's a critically important issue as well. Where we go with this is through these kinds of processes. National Zero Waste has created an opportunity for all of the stakeholders to really engage in a really important communication that probably we wouldn't have. When we set up discussions, they're for fairly focused and specific interest. Natalie's been involved in some of our recent discussions in her organization on extended producer responsibility. I have no doubt we'll have some conversations about extended producer responsibility, but that's a single, a focused kind of discussion. This is an opportunity to bring all the participants together and focus on not just those building blocks, because I think we're trying to get a handle on those, but where does this really take us in the long term? And I think where it takes us is some really interesting ideas, a world of zero waste, a world without any packaging waste whatsoever, which is what Packaging Association of Canada, interestingly enough, is all about right now. It takes us to the whole concept of moving from a linear to a circular economy.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your national take on this. For an international look at zero waste and what's happening overseas and country to country, Jamie Butterworth, if you could maybe share some of the successes your organization has had.
Yeah, sure, and I feel very honoured as a non-Canadian to be sitting up here, in fact. But I thought it'd be interesting to share a little bit as well around the circular economy, and I was thinking that kind of economics are probably as important here as anything. And to look at the way the economy works today, when we create value in the economy to make GDP effectively, we tend to take something out of the ground, turn it into a product, package it, sell it into a market, and at the end of the day, we discard the product and the packaging once it's finished its useful life. And if you look at the scale of that linearity, it's staggering. So if you take fast-moving consumer goods, so shampoos and food and things, we put $3.2 trillion of value into the global economy each year, and we throw away $2.7 trillion of that. So we waste 80% of the value in that supply chain, basically. And so this is at a time when we've seen a century's worth of price declines from 1900 to 2002 decline, sort of gradually, as we've got better at extracting and processing materials, whether they be agricultural commodities or metals or plastics from oil. And in about 2002, we've seen that century's worth of price declines erased in the past decade. So this is before we see the demand from an additional 3 billion middle-class consumers. We talk about this number a lot, but I worked it out with a colleague of mine the other day. That's the same number of people as you have in Vancouver becoming middle-class consumers every 3.5 days between now and 2030. So the demand for those resources will be significantly different over the next 10, 15, 20 years than it is today. So what a lot of people are now interested in is the idea of how you could begin to design an economy which is regenerative by design, and actually set it up such that the more you do, the better it gets. And this really is the concept of the circular economy. It's a generic term for a number of disciplines like biomimicry, cradle to cradle, industrial ecology, other areas, where you try to create an economy that is regenerative. And you end up, broadly speaking, with two types of stuff in the economy: technical materials or nutrients that cycle at the highest possible quality, and you try and move beyond recycling into remanufacturing, reuse, and service provision, and obviously biological materials, which is a huge part of the economy, which would be designed by intent to flow back through food and farming systems. And that provides a very powerful framework. It's very important in reducing waste, but it is also slightly different in that it starts to build an economy where you begin to restore the biological side of the economy, and it also creates significant economic and employment opportunities. And the analysis that we've done with McKinsey demonstrates that the technical side of the economy, this is a $630 billion opportunity just for a subset of the EU economy, for example, and $1 trillion opportunity for the biological side of the economy. So a lot of businesses are now very interested in this idea in terms of how they can win. And I think one comment that I heard yesterday from a large, fast-moving consumer goods company summed this up for me, which is we can do all the behavioral change campaigns that we wish to try and persuade people to put things in the right bin, and that is extremely important. But at the end of the day, if the business model and the economics don't add up, it's very difficult to scale that. And there was a chap from Nestle, and he said, I actually want more of my polymer back. I want more of my plastics back. I want to find a way to do that. I want to work to find out how I can get more of that volume back into my supply chain. So just one example of where that happens. And so the foundation who I work for, our aim is to try to accelerate the transition towards the circular economy. We work with a wide range of global corporations, emerging innovators, and that's why we're over in Vancouver, actually, to see whether we can provide some insight and connection to the other projects that are going on around the world to help to fast-track that, because we can learn a huge amount from what's worked and what hasn't worked, most importantly, probably, elsewhere in the world, and also engage the global companies who ultimately provide the feedstock in the economy, which translates into value.
Some staggering figures that you're mentioning there. It's certainly making the case, the business case for moving towards a zero waste economy. Natalie, given what you have heard then, what is the retailer's perspective? Why should retailers get on board? Why shouldn't they get on board? And what are some of the challenges for your sector?
So maybe the first thing thank you first, And I would like to really extend my thanks to everyone here, because I think it's wonderful to see so many people here on a Friday afternoon. So thanks a lot for being here. So the retail sector, first I wanted to maybe give a bit of the scope, and I think going to your point of how much we generate into the economy. So in Canada alone, we're talking about $467 billion that's been injected in the economy through the retail sector. It's one of the largest sector, employing 11% of the workforce, 2 million people in Canada. So it is really an important sector that we need also, because even if we go back to the circular economy approach, we still need to get that shampoo out again, because I would hope that we would want to continue using the shampoo in the products. So although we want to get the products back and the polymers and so on, we do need to, to service the customers and the consumers. In terms of the retail sector is quite engaged in sustainability, and we could talk about waste reduction, but just overall in sustainability, generally speaking, we're talking about partnerships with food banks, where millions of tons of food is being passed on to food banks, reduction of carbon footprint through changing some of the practices, and switching to LED lights, for instance. There's also a lot of engagement from the retail sector in food sourcing, sustainable food sourcing, and generally responsible procurement. But more specifically on the waste prevention and reduction side, there are also a lot of initiatives, and I'm sure you've seen some of those, and commitments to reduce the plastic bag consumption across Canada in the different provinces, achieving quite successful results across the board in some sectors like the groceries, up to 76% reduction of the plastic bags. So, the retail sector is really engaged. Looking at and you talked about the packaging situation, and I have, I would like to point out that there are a lot of initiatives currently going on to optimize packaging, because we still need some packaging, and obviously also to reduce the packaging. And I think that we are achieving those as well in terms of lowering the amount throughout the supply chain. So not only just at the end, but also before it even gets to the store. And I know, Michael, you didn't want me to talk about EPR programs, but I mean, certainly the retail sector is participating in over 100 programs across Canada. And I think that that shows their commitment to deliver and to try to ensure, that we take care of the material. I was really happy to hear you, Shelley, say that this is it's a truth to be told that we've changed from taxing residents to sending this bill to the consumers, and it's true in fact that we have to be honest. We've shifted some costs from municipalities and from local governments and from governments to the consumers, and that's a challenge, I think, that we need to discuss. And I know, Michael, you wanted to have a bigger, broader vision, but I think there are very interesting issues that we need to tackle first as well, at the same time as, looking forward and maybe, introducing more of that discussion about the circular economy. But first and foremost, we're facing, some shift in the cost. And we need this dialogue. And I was very happy to hear this, that, we need this dialogue, because I was going to propose that we change the extended producer responsibility to maybe an extended consumer responsibility, to maybe even better, an extended shared responsibility. And so maybe we need to start looking at this dialogue and acknowledging that, in fact, we're levied, and most of the time the retail sector is collecting those levies to make sure that the system is working. So we all have a shared responsibility. The local governments, I think we need to be to have this dialogue, because, and I'll give you just a quick example. Organic waste, for instance, everyone is going into organics waste. Quebec has a ban for 2020, Metro Vancouver for next year. Where are the infrastructures? Where are how is this going to be paid? How is the retail sector affected by this going to be able to keep the material and make sure that they derive, in the circular economy, you want to get it back too. You want to get, you want to keep your material. So some local governments have been collecting the material away from the retail sector, for instance, and not reducing the taxes, and certainly not engaging in dialogue where we can find how we can meet those needs. From a government's perspective, I think we need to improve the dialogue, because governments are regulating on a regular basis. And Michael, you talked about it, but we have numerous different regulations. It's not harmonized. Each provincial government is adopting different regulation, which then we have different types of programs, different types of targets, if no targets. The cost of the products or the recycling are different. So all of these things, it's becoming a nightmare to manage 100 programs. Can you imagine some of the retailers have 450 reports to produce a year, issuing sometimes checks of $17 to cover a program cost. So we need to streamline. And not just government needs to work together to streamline this, but the businesses as well, because we've created ourselves some organizations to manage these collectives, and we've made ourselves into we've brought ourselves into a situation where we're actually facing more red tape from our own organization, or just as much red tape as with the government. And obviously, I think the last piece of this puzzle is the consumer. Where is the consumer into this? Because the consumers are footing the bill, really, because obviously at the end of the day, the businesses, the shareholders, they will not pay this out of their pockets, because you need the business. You want the economy. You certainly don't want those 2 million jobs to disappear, because it would be bad for Canada and for the economy. So the bottom line is the consumers are paying, but they're not involved, they're not engaged. And as you were mentioning, the behavior, we could have the best campaigns in the world, but at the end of the day, if the material is not coming back, we're punishing the retailers, we're punishing the producers, we're saying they're not achieving the targets. But if you and I don't put the material in the bins, and if you and I don't do that on a regular basis, we're not going to get anywhere. So it's a shared responsibility. So let's talk.
Well, on that note, I could almost sense Michael trying to leap out of his chair. I'm sure you have lots of thoughts on that. But I think it's a very valid point you're making, Natalie, about how this is such, it might almost feel an overwhelming problem. It's so huge. How do we move it forward, an agenda towards zero waste, as opposed to feeling paralyzed by how many 457 reports that you have to file as a corporation. There's an interesting quote that was passed along to me from a board member from the National Zero Waste Council, and Shelley, I'd like you to respond to it. They said, recycling on steroids by itself will not solve the issues that we have with waste in Canada. Work must be done to stop waste from being created in the first place, which I don't think people would disagree with, but it seems to be the million-dollar question, Shelley. In terms of concrete moves towards stopping the creation of waste, what would you suggest? What are some key steps?
Well, it's why we do have to tackle it depending on what's in the stream. Getting rid of streamlining the reports isn't going to do it. Changing the fee structure isn't going to do it. The fee structure is there because there is a cost to any kind of collection. Organics, you can say, oh, you saved money by collecting organics. That's true. A lot of taxpayers / consumers, it's the same person. They're paying both ways. Think that there, I put it in it's a green bin in Toronto. I put it in the green bin and I reduced the garbage can. And why is the cost of garbage in my tax bill still going up? It's because as soon as you decide you're going to do that, you're now going to have to build the infrastructure to process it. Ontario, for instance, right now it's at 1.2 million tons of organics collection. That will grow to 1.6 if we don't change a single thing in the next 20 years. And the cost of creating the infrastructure for doing that is in the range, because we are very under-resourced right now to find the processing capacity to deal with all those organics, is in the range of $3 to $4 billion. So great, we took it out, we reduced the residual waste, but I'm going to have to build $4 billion worth of infrastructure. And while it's a municipal responsibility, you know what happens when a municipality is faced with a bill that size. Mr. Province, knock, 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 can you help us with this infrastructure need? That's a need they don't really want to go near. We're happy. We think that is a ground level responsibility. It is a local government that should deal with it. But the price tag's too big. That's why just streamlining the programs by which we collect revenue to build all of this infrastructure isn't really the answer. We've got a phenomenon going on in Toronto right now that's going on here in this community as well, in the city of Vancouver. Condominiums are getting smaller. We have a young demographic. And so you can say to them, don't go to Costco and buy a block of cheese that you're going to throw out and create food waste. And they'll say, absolutely. I have a 561 square foot condo. I want to go to a little small Marché high-end concept grocery store and just buy enough for today, because that's all I want in my tiny little condo. Well, that, in a way, you think that's going to reduce waste, but it only works if we go all the way there. Okay, fine, let's look at the market and the housing situation in a place and make sure that the retail matches it, but what if the packaging doesn't? What if he's creating the same amount of waste for the stream as he would have if he lived in a bigger house, went to a bigger store, and bought something that threw it away? So we've got to look at what's the volume that's really needed to sustain a community, but also how do you get it to them as efficiently and as wisely and as with the best design and the least packaging possible. And where there is packaging, how do you close that loop? Just creating recycling that you're going to ship to China to be turned into something else doesn't really do it, because the costs just keep escalating and escalating, such that you're saying, I'm addressing waste, not reducing it, I'm addressing it. That's why the circular economy approach to this, localizing it, but also turning it into other products, and also reducing at source, is so crucial to Canada. It's something that really, if you listen to Jamie, you realize we haven't really started looking at it in that way.
Jamie, if you could just continue with that thought, because if we are calling for a circular economy, specifically, can you give us some examples of how companies have changed and how governments have changed as well to help enable this?
Yeah, sure. And I think what's interesting here in a way is you could end up with a business versus regulation. And I think what would be more helpful would be to move that into pioneers, asking to be on a level playing field. And I'll tell one example of where we've seen some action around that. And I'm going to try and use something which is in kind of fast-moving consumer goods, because that seems to be a lot of this topic. So things like food waste and packaging and areas like that. So we have a couple of companies in the UK, actually. They operate in Asia as well, but one is called Marks & Spencer's, M&S, and the other one is called B&Q. It's one of the world's largest home improvement companies. And both of these companies said, we think the key thing here is that there's value, and we need to get all the right players together to capture that value. So ultimately, we know that we're putting valuable materials out into the market, whether they be packaging or products, but we need to be able to design those products right materials, right design. We need to be able to set the business model up so people win in the value chain, and we need to be able to also get the collection, treatment, and sorting right. Okay. So in order to do that, we're going to have to bring together the waste collection companies, the manufacturers of our products, because we're retailers, right the way through into the chain, basically. And they did some very simple things. And I'll give one example of what they did. So these two companies, they looked at packaging film. So when you've got a product and you package it in film, And one of these companies looked at how many different types of film they used. And they found out they used over 72 different types of plastic film. So then they said, how many do we need to use? Right? 3. Okay? So they said to the recycling company, if we can use 3 types of film and we change our volume from 72 different tiny little amounts of waste, we can turn that into a large feedstock. Could you do something useful with that? Oh yeah, we could definitely do something useful with that. So that's something that's exciting for us, right? So that's just one example of many, many different bits. So everyone in that one, actually, everybody made a margin. So now we have those companies and many others actually going to the government and saying, actually, your policy isn't keeping up with what we're trying to do fast enough. We now want you to start to eliminate some of the unhelpful materials which are in the supply chain, to make it easier for us to go to an optimized palette of materials and to create the right volumes with the waste collectors and recyclers and kind of optimize this process. So rather than it being we're going to regulate and we're going to force you to change what you're trying to do, which might be part of it, to like push, but at the same time, there's also from the other side saying we actually want to work with you to inform this process and to help to put us on a level playing field so we can capture those opportunities.
But I just want to say it, and I'm happy to hear about experiences out of Canada, but we already do these experiences as well. Those, thinking about what's out there and then how we can make sure that we're collecting the right material, ensuring that as you were mentioning, some of those compounds in the packaging is out, working with the recyclers in terms of, for instance, getting rid of the PVC, ensuring that the PET that's being recycled is got the right labels so that you can get rid of the labels easily. So all of these things are also occurring here. And so I think it's important to say that we're also working on these issues, and it's not just about some of the reporting, but I think over and above, and I think that we need to have this conversation so that we have more time to do those projects as opposed to responding to the regulatory sort of framework. I think that working on the consumer behavior is good, but at the end of the day, there's still, a lot of the packaging that is required, whether it's by law, whether it's by necessity. So we have to think about that as well. We have to optimize it, yes, and we're working on those things. But, we can't cut everything. We can't cut all of the cheese that we eat. Maybe we can reduce and make sure that we talk to consumers in general. And it's a public role. It's not just the role of it's the role of everybody, and that's why I say we have a shared responsibility into this.
And I can say that's why we're all here. I think it's really important to understand, first of all, this is not a packaging discussion. Packaging is a tiny
Yes.
subset of the larger issue. The mere fact that all of those EPR programs that exist for other materials, I think, testifies to the fact that it's not just a packaging material. Packaging is a consumer issue, it's a top-of-mind issue, and I can tell you that every politician uses the same twist-tie story that Erica uses.
Because they've all been there, they're not making it up.
I have honestly heard that very same story, almost word for word, around ministerial tables. So it's top of mind of everybody. But that's not the problem. If we want to start understanding the magnitude of the problem, or take a slightly different perspective, it's not a consumer problem, or if we define a consumer as the residential consumer, and most of our conversations on waste management to date have been about the residential consumer. All the references to consumer companies and that, and that's actually where a lot of really interesting, fascinating activity is happening. But that's the smallest proportion of where waste is being generated in Canada. That's a third, ballparkish, and 2/3 comes from institutional and commercial. So if you're saying, okay, let's quantify what the problem is, forget what we can do about it, but just the magnitude of the problem, surely to goodness, you want to start paying attention to the 2/3. Now, Does EPR apply in that sector? In some cases, yes. In some cases, no. Do the retailers have a place to play in that? Yes, because there's a lot of B2B activity going on there in certain areas. What do you do with other kinds of products? Carpets, textiles. We're going to have a conversation offline about textiles. But textiles in a hospital environment are different from textiles in a different kind of environment. Got to deal with it. So, but that's all in a sector that we're not really involved with right now, and we haven't engaged in this broader conversation. So I just want us to keep in mind that this is not a packaging issue, and it's not a retailer or a consumer issue. There's a whole lot of other parts to it. Other point I just want to throw out there, money's not the answer. Building infrastructure is not necessarily the answer. Two quick observations. One, we're still working within a system here because we've got municipalities, we've got provinces, we've got the federal government that is a 19th century construct trying to deal with 21st century problems. I'm not speaking for any of my member governments, any of my member officials. Dave Ransom from BC is out there and others. But it seems to me that a worthy conversation in this country might be maybe we need to reconceptualize what the responsibilities collectively are. And maybe municipal boundaries aren't necessarily the way to go. There has been a movement in Eastern Canada, for instance, to regionalize landfills. I'm not saying that that's a solution, but it's an interesting development in a particular area of the country. And it may be coincidental, but I don't think it is, that Nova Scotia has got the lowest per capita amount of waste in this country. 389 kilograms per person, still a huge amount of waste. But the highest volume is 1,000 and change coming out of Alberta. Interestingly enough, Nova Scotia and Alberta are the highest per capita spenders on municipal waste diversion. I'm not sure what conclusions you draw from that, but it's really interesting data.
Michael, I just want to go to some of the questions that have been submitted on Poll Everywhere, because I think this one at the top here is addressing some of what has come up already. Why should we be trucking compost across the city to expensive city-run facilities when we can compost in our parks, backyards, and local green space? Changing our attitudes about waste require us to be brought closer to our waste rather than continuing the old out of sight, out of mind attitude. What will the National Zero Waste Council do to prepare consumers to re-engage with us, to not believe that we can sweep our trash under the rug anymore? Who would like to take that? As they all back away.
Well, I can tell you that I think that, for a small group, this may be possible, but I mean, we've got to look at it also that it may not be possible to compost in everyone's backyard. Not everybody has a backyard also, but so, and obviously, and I go back to what Michael was saying about the IC&I sector, so the industrial and commercial and institutional sector. So I'm not sure you would want to have the hospital's compost pile into your backyard. And we do even see this when those discussions are occurring that the consumers are not on board with this. So there's a lot of social acceptability that still needs to occur to be able to discuss having some of those sites in your backyard. So you have to find solutions, and I think from the perspective of the businesses, they're taking on those projects, and I think certainly on the composting side of things, there are numerous pilot projects, and they're taking those responsibilities and are trying to find solutions.
Well, and it seems that some of the reluctance towards paying the bill for composting or what have you is consumer, the approach or the responsibility that people feel they have versus our governments. One of the questions on Poll Everywhere says, shared responsibility is a great idea in a utopian world. However, we all know if we wait to change consumer behavior, it will take us until the precipice of collapse. We need the voice and will of the growing majority to be backed by federal level intervention in law, regulation, implementation. Start the cooperation between manufacturers through to local governments. So obviously, Michael and Natalie, you might see see this question differently, but Michael, if you could comment on that do we need more of a stick than a carrot?
I'm not sure
You're
which.
speechless.
Well, no, I actually don't know the answer to that. A lot of what I've heard, a lot of what the conversations have been, have focused on consumer behavior, and I think a lot of focus needs to be on consumer behavior, where we're focusing on the consumer, the residential consumer. But that, as I said earlier, it doesn't address where the lion's share of that stuff is. A federal government is a participant in CCME discussions along with all the provinces and the territories. So they're at the table, they're engaged in these discussions. Is there a constitutional place for the federal government? One can argue it both ways. But the federal responsibility is largely in this area on toxics and hazardous waste, and the other responsibility devolves to the provinces, who in turn have pretty well handed that off to municipalities.
But even at the national level then, should there be more implementation of regulation, I think, is the question this person is asking.
I don't think there's a government in this country that really wants to bring about more regulation. I think we've got the frameworks in place. What we really need to do is get them working. I've got personally a lot of sympathy with some of the complaints that Natalie and others have about some of the programs, but they're concerns, criticisms about details, not about the broader policy approach. We have shifted and are in the process of shifting the costs from the taxpayer to individual consumers, whether those are corporate consumers or residential consumers. My sense is we've got much of the broad framework in place. What we really need to do is take advantage of the dialogue of the brains of the people engaged in all of this. Understand that there is a tremendous amount happening, not just in governments but across. We talk about partnerships. We've been working with Sustainable Packaging Coalition, EEQ out of Quebec. I forget the other one, Packaging Association of Canada, to develop the design guide, which is one of the things that National Zero Waste is quite focused on. They delivered it. But it initiated out of a discussion we had. So things happen, and they don't always happen at a high political level. They don't always happen at a legal or regulatory level. So are we not getting the message out? Yes, absolutely.
But Michael, when we say things happen, they happen, but not to the point where there's this common understanding across this vast nation of an initiative that you may have been able to achieve within one Ministry of Environment area because they were receiving pressure, whether at the manufacturer level or from local governments, and so something is achieved. But does it then roll out across the country? We wanted to have I'm back to consumers again, but we wanted to have a serious conversation in Toronto about the makeup of coffee cups and how we tackle that, because we're just for our city, and I'm not even talking about the greater Toronto area, just for the inner city of Toronto, 1 million cups from one retailer, 1 million a year, are showing up in the landfill. And I'm not even talking about the other one. And as you know, there are a good 3 biggies in the coffee world. We measured and counted up just one of them. And so we wanted to have that conversation. We might well achieve it because that's a huge market. And there's probably a cost imperative to their cooperating with that discussion and actually doing that, because they can produce enough of them that they can get the unit cost down for a city the size of Toronto. But what's the potential for them to be able to make people happy right across the country if we now then extend that out across the country? Are they ready to do that? Are they ready to go door to door to each of your MOEs and say, here's what we have had to do in Ontario. We could really be doing it all across the country, and then my cost per unit is not going to skyrocket, and I've actually made you all happy. It just requires that national conversation, that federal conversation, or that collaborative conversation to say, as long as it doesn't fly in the face of a process here, there, and everywhere, then yes, let's go there. What you've now created is a new manufacturer, whatever you came up with. What city isn't looking to have manufacturing jobs in their community? So it rolls out from there. And while it's happening, that's something that touches the ground level consumer, because they see that happening. Heaven knows governments and the producer will brag about it. But planting that in their mind actually leads to them going into their workplace and saying, what changes can I make at the workplace level? I've seen this one at the level of my morning cup of coffee. All local governments can do is make the impression at that level. What you hope is it then goes into whatever world they're engaged in professionally, and it rolls out from there. I think that was probably the very beginning of circular economy. Someone saying, okay, I'm putting in that blue box, but I haven't solved the problem. Where do we go from there? So that's why local governments stay talking about the consumer level. We hope that we're driving the mindset that takes you all the way up to the manufacturer level, and other orders of government saying, okay, we don't collect the waste from the curb, but we can affect the environment through this engagement.
Hope gives you an excuse for failure. And that's why National Zero
Don't
Waste.
tweet that.
That's why it's important to have the dialogues, the collaboration, the mechanisms for collaboration, and that's the value. Since at the end of the day, this is about National Zero Waste Council. That's the value of something like that, where we can park some of our interests, some of our concerns, and engage in those kind of dialogues, learn about these useful ideas, and share them and exchange them right across the country. I think at the end of the day, on a very practical basis, we'll end up with far more effective change from that than we will through a whole lot of additional regulation and legislation.
But what makes that first really young millennial have the brilliant idea that he's got to do that?
He's your constituent.
I wanted to ask him
There you
too.
go.
So can I come in on
right
that
in.
point?
Please
so I
do.
think what makes the young millennial ask that question is having a vision of where you ultimately want to get to. And that's what the circular economy provides. It provides you with a model for an economy which is regenerative. Now, you won't get there on day 1 or day 100,
Right.
but ultimately you have a framework that everyone's bought into that you are working towards. Now, I think that, firstly, to have that coherent framework is important, and that's why I'm really excited that this group has been set up. I think the next thing then is to bring together the key representatives to make that happen. And I think, in a way, there should be a business leader here from a company in Canada, like we'd have the CEO of M&S or someone in the UK, actually championing this from their side and saying, we want to make this happen, right? So I think, and then I think it's about asking the right question in terms of how we're actually going to make this happen. I'll just give you one kind of very quick anecdote on the young person and how does it inspire them. We do a lot of work around education, and we were working in design technology with a group of students, and one of the students had been doing their GCSE project when they were 15, 16. And they said to their teacher at the time, I can't think of anything to design. Everything's kind of been done before, whether it's your coffee cup or your chair or whatever it happens to be. Once I learned about the framework of the circular economy, now everything I see, I want to redesign. And I think it's having that vision of where we want to get to is a common understanding is interesting.
So Jamie, then if the council is focused on preventing waste in the first place, give us some examples of what you think are the low-hanging fruit. What products or areas where might we see the most change most quickly?
So, and also, I think within that model, it isn't necessarily about reducing to zero waste, if I may say. So actually, it may be that like we're talking about food waste. One of the biggest issues with extracting value from food waste is the packaging around the food waste. That means it's difficult to get it at volume. You may actually end up putting slightly more packaging around something, but if it's made out of the right nutrient to feed into the right flow, ultimately within the system, it may have a better outcome. So it is a bit more complicated than that, I guess. Mm-hmm. And I think that in the big opportunities, I think I come to your point, Michael, that actually really coffee cups are a very small volume flow. They're very visible to people, so we really think that that's something like plastic bags in the UK is always a really big issue. Yeah. But if you actually look at the amount of embedded energy and material and labor in those products compared to electronics and electrical equipment or construction materials and others. So I think it would be interesting to do almost like an analysis of the highest volume potential.
So what one, if you could offer a couple of specifics for products or areas that you think there could be, if not plastic bags and single-use?
Well, I mean, I think, as I say, electronic equipment would be huge in terms of what you're talking about there. There's some I think the other interesting thing I was thinking here as well, as I said before, is you're not alone in this challenge in Canada. There are countries all around the world struggling with exactly the same problems, who have probably tried and tested and failed in many instances, where we can learn from their mistakes. And there will be cultural specificities and legal specificities, but ultimately we can learn from those as well. So I think things like waste electronics, construction, other areas around remanufacturing, which are huge economic employment opportunities outside of the lower value, fast-moving consumer goods.
There's another question from the floor, but I do encourage people, would you like to come to the mic? Yeah.
I have been listening to the conversation, and if you take me back 10 years, we're repeating the same thing over and over and over. We're focusing on the end user, which is endless process. The problem, the root problem is we're promoting two conflicting cultures. One, economic growth, more consumption, more use of material. At the same time, we're talking about zero waste. It's really two conflicting ideas. So this is a major problem. Like I see we're focusing on end user. This is not the way we should approach zero waste. We approach it from changing the culture. We cannot, like as Jamie said, we're generating $3.2 trillion dollars of material. Do we have to? That's the question. We don't. If we look, people in some countries living in $2 a day. You go there, I guarantee you there is no much waste. Why? Because they are still living. So we really need to change the conversation into how can we turn our culture to be a more conservative culture. We live within our means. I mean, means we're, as again Jamie said, we have billions of people now trying to live the same life we're living today. We don't have resources on Earth that can do this work.
Okay, so the question then is basically, how do we overhaul our thinking, the consumers' thinking, the people responsible for protecting us in terms of our legislation? We need a fundamental shift. How do we start to convince people that what we're doing today is not sustainable?
Absolutely, and that's the way we should go.
All right.
Don't waste
Any
our
particular
time in
person to
prediction.
start, or who would like to jump in?
You also heard the concern from the first comments. Where do you enter into the whole stream to do this? Is it at the end user? Is it at the beginning of the line? And I think part of the reason that having a zero waste council now, whether zero is actually where you're going to end up or not, it gave people a quick idea, reference of what some of the goals are here. But enter it at any level, and we've now reached a point where there's a cost imperative for all of us, the end user, the local government that serves them, the manufacturer, the producer, the retailer. There's a cost for all of us, and not just in packaging, but in every piece of what we do. If you change the way you design a product, how many square feet is the store now? We are running out of real estate. We're building vertical neighborhoods. So at any point you enter the stream, and in the manufacture, in the construction of the building in the first place, everyone is focused on cost. Particularly now, I think we're at the best juncture to start this, because all of us in every walk of life and at any level took a big hit in 2008, 2009, and learned no economy is ever guaranteed forever. We all know that now at every generation. So enter any entry point, there's a cost imperative there to actually not just figuring out ways to charge for it, but ways to make it stop it being there.
The point, as you know from your work, that is endless process. We cannot afford the cost of the program that we're talking about here today. We cannot afford it. because it's
Exactly.
So
But
we
you
need
and
to
I are
shift.
on the same side on that.
Yes, so we
So
need to shift.
construction, let's look at construction. We talk about the consumer at home in his kitchen. How do we make it put things in the right box? How do we change the way the contractor builds something?
Yeah, but
Legislation.
That's a real how does he buy his materials and how does he deal with them and how does he change all of his practices in the actual construction of a giant building or a project? At any point, there's a real cost imperative now to
Yeah.
really stop and look at your practice.
But
Perhaps
you
I
need-
could ask,
you
just
need
jump
to
in
let
and
it-
ask Jamie to touch on
Yeah.
this for a second, because I think what you're talking about is we need to see a global mind shift,
Yeah.
largely about consumerism.
Yes,
And
and
North
lift-
America is unlike any, most other countries in the world, continents, right?
and lift our conversation, our discussion, dialogue here up to a national level where we can influence the culture. If we don't change the culture of consumerism, nothing would happen.
Okay, so I
And-
see a lot of questions, people are lined up at the mic, so thank you for that, and if you could just touch on that briefly, Jamie.
So I think that is an interesting question. And I think it's
question.
also a question around economic development.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I mean, if you look at China in the last 10 years, 1 billion people have moved into the middle classes, right? Now, is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, if you ask them, they'd probably say that was a good thing, right? Because they've got access to pharmaceuticals,
Education.
to living in a nice house, having access to mobility, access to culture. So I think the question maybe is, could you change their behavior to make them not wish to have that? Or could you come up with an economy that would enable them to live in an economy which ultimately was regenerative? I want to give one example of one thought around this. So there's a car manufacturer in Europe called Renault, part of Renault Nissan. They have a model now where they sell electric vehicles, so they sell mobility, but they also got a guy there. They also have the ability to remanufacture and upgrade components, right? So what they can do is they can take the engine or the drivetrain or the gearbox of a vehicle at the end of its life. They can send it through a plant called Romorantin, which, by the way, is the most profitable of all of their plants, and they can remanufacture it and even upgrade it into those components with the same warranty and the same guarantee as a new one, using 85% less energy than the original component and huge amounts of embodied labor and water and all the other areas, right? They also have a plant in Tangier which is run 100% on renewable energy. So I think one of the questions there is, if you can create a model for the economy which is regenerative, is there an issue with people having access to those elements? So I think that there are issues potentially in the economy at the macro level in terms of how we can't internalize externalities. But I think that deep philosophical question, I think it's to some extent difficult to question whether people can have what we have in the Western world, and actually maybe more helpful to think how we can create a framework such that we can build a prosperous economy which is regenerative.
Yeah, I'm talking about us going down, not them going up.
Yep.
We need to cut our consumption. We are over expending our resources.
Thank you so much for your comments, and I think you've made your point, and we've certainly heard it. Unfortunately, because we have so little time left, and I do want to get to people on the floor, if I could ask people to keep their questions concise, and for the panelists as well, and then we can try to cover as much territory as we can. We'll just go back and forth, so gentlemen here.
Yeah, well, my big issue is plastics, because it's kind of an exponential problem. I probably don't have to tell everybody here how every year it never goes away. It builds up and it builds up. And NCorp that we have here with our the deposit return on beverage containers proves conclusive, because they have somewhere in the 90% return range. Obviously, contrary to what was said up there, I think everything comes from legislation and putting a price. The problem with plastics is that the price of plastic is barely measurable, but the cost is immeasurable to the world. So just like we have a carbon tax, you have a plastic tax, and you can under this system you could actually get rid of the toxic and non-recyclable ones, the 3s, the 6s, and 7s, by giving them a higher tax value. You could bring it in gradually over time, but price it so you don't have to do deposit return. All plastic has a price, so that the binners, the street people are picking the plastic up off the street because it's valuable. The idea that this stuff has no value is mad. It's just mad. So you have to put a price on stuff. So it is not, disposability is not an option.
So is your question then specifically around plastics, why is there no regulation?
It comes
that
from
would
federal government, or
own a
preferably the
responsibility?
United Nations. I mean, but
Quick answer though. You can tax it. That's great. I'll get the tax. I'm a government member. Give me that tax revenue. Now I'm addicted to that revenue, and nothing changes
Well,
about that plastic
no,
because
no,
once you build a stream into the
it
revenue
really does
system of a
change.
government, they really need it to keep it coming.
No,
and the
because
next
if
thing you
it's
know, you got a
expensive-
pile of plastic in the Indian Ocean.
the point is that if you make it expensive enough, it will stop being used so profligately. It will stop piling up because people will not use it as stupidly as they do now, because it will become expensive. Therefore, the use of it will be much more measured and useful and less useless.
Sounds like hope.
Yeah, well, you could call me a
Jamie,
dreamer,
jump
but
in.
somebody has to think big because it's a big problem, right?
Yeah.
Just a thought on that, on your point. And I think that there are two sides to it, I think, as well. Because if you take, plastics, and you look at different streams, if you look at PET, for example, PET actually is relatively circular. It's about 50% circular in the economy because a lot of collaboration has happened between the manufacturers with the collectors, treaters, recyclers to come up with a standardized type, reduce the number of additives, set up the supply chains. And actually, even in developing countries, there's often an informal network where collection takes place of PET. If you take polypropylene, and in fact, somebody gave me a polypropylene yak yesterday from Canada, I think. Do you have yaks in Canada?
No.
Maybe not. Anyway, so maybe it was. Anyway, so they gave me a
That must
polypropylene,
be a BC thing.
which made me think about this. And the polypropylene industry is, polypropylene globally is 96% linear. So that means 96% of all of the polypropylene that enters the global economy gets landfilled or burned at the end of its life, right? So we did a little study into this. The reason that that isn't the case, there's no standardization. There's loads of different types of polypropylene. There's loads of different additives. There's no purity that you can realize what you've got in the market. There's no interaction between the manufacturers and the guys in the supply chain. So basically, I think there's two sides to that, solving that issue. One of them could be to put the right levers in place to make sure you separate out the wrong types of polymer. But I also think there's huge opportunity right now today to get the right people around the table. That's actually, we're doing that now on polypropylene using the World Economic Forum, but getting the right people around the table to ask the right question and to start to turn that, what is currently waste, into a feedstock in the economy.
But I just want to say that it's very interesting, and I think that may be part of our framework here. We need to think about how it's not helping this type of initiative, because currently the system, the way it is, and we're feeding the beast that, is that no matter what you do, you have to pay so much at the end of the year. So the collection, transportation, and then it's divided up amongst the different types of material. So no matter how good you are or how good you want to become, you still have the same bill to foot from, the perspective of the consumers paying into the system. So it's the same. So whichever material you're transporting, you still have the same cost. So when we have those initiatives and we're trying to change the supply chain and we're working on trying to get more PET that's valuable and it's in a circular economy type model, then you don't get any reward, because at the end of the year, you still have to pay the same amount to the municipalities and through the system, or the different product programs that exist. So we have to sit down and allow us to work together to work on those hurdles, because they're major hurdles, because you don't see the benefit of doing this, having, different initiatives going on. So
I'm going to jump in and continue on. I hope you heard a little bit of something that you were looking for. Ultimately, though, of course, manufacturers aren't using these materials because they didn't know any better. They are using things that are to the environment because it's cheap and easy, and we need to have a fundamental shift there, I think, in terms of how much we want to contribute to waste versus providing things at the dollar store. Over here, you've been waiting very patiently.
I think, you know, it has the, no, sorry. Go ahead.
Hi, my name's Christine, and I wanted to respond actually to Shelley's remark first with municipality infrastructure. You mentioned you're collecting 1.2 billion, was it kilos or something of tons? Oh my gosh!
NNES, yeah.
of the waste, and I heard you taking the burden of how are we going to create this infrastructure. I did my master's in sustainability theory in Britain, and had the lovely chance of living in Bristol, where they have been doing the bio collection for tons of years. And I was just interested because in that situation, an entrepreneur came up, and the company, they deal with the recycling of the content, and then they sell it to farms. And in the spirit of a circular economy, wouldn't it be great for the municipality to think of innovative entrepreneurial ideas and opening it up to entrepreneurial people so that they themselves don't have to do the infrastructure, and it can be done in a profitable base?
Oh, here's the thing. Let me give you a reality, and you really have to wrap your head around the scope. Jamie can, coming from different cities, but remember something about Toronto and its volumes. Toronto is larger than Vancouver by the size of Montreal.
I don't know how big Montreal is.
Well, you know how big Vancouver is. Montreal is a little bigger, and we are larger than Vancouver if you put the two of them together, you almost get to the population of
So then we better
Toronto.
get thinking creatively.
So here's the assignment. When I gave those volumes, that's the infrastructure for the stuff that we can't find a home for using beneficial use. Toronto captures biogas in some of its facilities, sells about $100 million worth of electricity through that, does a lot of beneficial use in Ontario and Quebec, parts of Manitoba, and parts of New York and Ohio. And then at the end of it, they still have so much volume that they need to build all that infrastructure for that they can't market out in that way. So what I'm saying is, someone asked earlier about couldn't we just compost it in our green spaces? We do. There's a joke in my area. We're allowed to get the leaf and yard waste that gets captured by our organics program. The compost that's created by that, we're allowed to have compost days and give it out to our residents. And there's a joke that where I live, Seneca Hill will soon be a mountain, because I promote it so much and I pay extra to have extra compost days, and people come and gather up as much as that's ending up in the land. And that still leaves me with enough that we still end up having to do anaerobic processing to the tune of 20 years from now we'll have spent $3 to $4 billion to keep up with that. That's why just figuring out those natural uses for it and the infrastructure uses, the problem never ends unless we start reducing the volume.
Okay, and
Yeah.
on that note, along those lines, the question is, in a perfect zero waste world where nothing becomes something that needs to be recycled or disposed of, many recycling and disposal companies will become extinct. How do we get support from companies that are in that financial conflict of interest? Michael.
Oh, I hate to give an old political quote, but government's not in the business of picking winners and losers. I mean, there's going to be an economic construct there if you accept the underlying premise. It seems to me, I mean, one of the tweets here is about this being an elusive goal. Going to a zero waste circular economy might be an elusive goal. I don't think any of this is. One of the things I've heard over the last 3 days have been an enormous range of ideas in all sorts of sectors that at their root are taking stuff that we're throwing away, whether it's flaring gas or whether it's fugitive emissions or whatever, and finding an economic use for them. It's not a technological problem, though it is in some cases, but fundamentally it's an economic problem. And the reality is, and if we're going to start working way out there, the way to drive this is to change the fundamentals of our economics and start incorporating in real terms into those real costs the environmental and social costs, just as we currently assess the financial costs. So if you got a plastic bottle, we're talking about raw material costs. We're not talking about the long-term environmental costs. We're not talking about whatever the social costs might be around all of that. If we had real accounting for all of those costs, there would be all sorts of economic drivers, all sorts of economic incentives, all sorts of entrepreneurs popping up all over the place to deal with that. That, to me, long-term, is the way to get down to this eventual goal. But we're so far away from that. I'm an eternal optimist when it comes to this, but I've been sort of following the edges of that conversation for at least the last decade, and it's been going on for a lot longer. I think the conversation is changing. Business is driving that conversation, not governments. And that's a really interesting thing to watch. So to me, that's the long term. That's what's going to be happening down there.
I'm at a disadvantage because I can't see who's sitting here is from Waste Management and BFI and all the biggies. Waste is such big business that if we really think about it, give them a shout out, because wherever we have gone in the last little while, and we haven't gone to reducing, we've just gone to, we've got a new idea and a new way we want to process, and you've probably got it. They've actually been incredibly nimble for the last 25 years. Each new practice that we say, we're going to make our residents do this, these private companies have found a way. We'll be the ones who do that for you. They've just gone there with us. Yeah.
Gentleman over here.
Okay. So I want to talk about the fundamental basis of the issues that we are discussing today. The fundamental basis is because of people are consuming. We cannot survive without consuming. We have to eat, we have to wear, and everything. And then think about what we are doing every day. We are looking for the better economy. And then basically, it's not going to work. As long as we consume, economy is boosting up, and then as soon as we stop the consuming, economy will crash, then your life will be gone. Basically, the way that you're trying to recycle or everything, it also requires energy to go through. Transportation, everything. So in the bottom line, there's no such a thing to stop or reducing them. Only the way that you can think of is having the people really being educated. The reason that the people are consuming is simple. They want to be happy. They want better ones to be happy. They want better educations to be happy. They want to have something to be happy. So the bottom line is that what you're looking for is, I believe, that is real education. Not education, not like in the university in current stage. As you can see that the universities are training people to be in marketing and then good at the making the people consuming, how to make people to fall into buy something and then consume more. That's what university really want. I mean, and then that's the reason is because that the society wants, entire world wants.
Do you have a specific question for someone?
Yeah, at the end. Okay.
Wait, we're running out of time, so if I can
Right.
ask you to
Okay.
keep it short.
So I'll make it simple. So basically, the fundamental issues is to make the people happy is the education, but not current university education or anything. Now, let me ask you this. I know that you fundamentally deep inside of your brain, you probably know this. But only thing that you cannot really do anything about the education is because you cannot. Because basically, we have to return all the things upside down and then making everything from the scratch without having more promoting something. My question is, will you be ready for it?
All right. How about the Retail Council of Canada jumping in on that?
Just throw me under the bus here, eh? That's an easy one.
That was more like
So,
a semi-trailer.
I think this is beyond the scope of this discussion. I believe, we could talk, these are economic issues for governments also. I mean, we always measured our growth through economic, growth. So, at this point, we're trying to deal with waste prevention and waste management, and I think that the one piece of nugget in there is maybe we need to also have those conversations, but I think that's not for not for me.
All right, very well handled. A question here, I've just been told we can have this room for another 10 or 15 minutes if we want to go over a little bit because we have a lot of people at the mics. Is that something that we would like to do? Okay. And if not, just feel free to leave quietly. But that's great. So we can continue on if you guys aren't pressed to be anywhere else.
Sure.
All right, over here.
Thank you. My name is Lior. I'm an entrepreneur from Calgary, specializing in producing zero waste events. And definitely, the comment made earlier, I definitely don't feel that that's an elusive target. I've seen that in practice over and over. So in Alberta, despite some of the criticism earlier and building on some of the other comments that were made, there's a really interesting program that I think relates to fundamentally the most successful consumer engagement program that exists around the returnable or refundable bottles. So in Alberta, when you return your bottles, you get that money back. But if you don't, that money then is actually funneled to an organization that specifically is designed, they're an arm length from the government organization to do public education. And in my opinion, public education is the fundamental piece that puts pressure on some of the industrial and consumer players that you're talking about addressing. But and this kind of builds on that tax question, but I think that, using this innovative model of actually using that money to fund a public education arm, why couldn't there be, beyond just refundable bottles and cans, programs that put a premium on virtually everything we consume that then goes towards funding consumer education programs if that
So that
product
one
isn't
I
returned
want
back?
to answer.
All right. Take it away.
Because this is deposit system. So don't forget that you actually paid for that. So when you bought the product, you paid for the deposit
Yeah,
and the
which is
money
great.
that you get in return. So, but that doesn't take care of the material. It's good for those types of material because they're worth something. So if you're going to be recycling PET or aluminum cans and you get your 5 cents and then they make money out of, getting those containers and that's fine but what about the other materials? So we need to also look to the other materials that may not generate now as much money. So the deposit system wouldn't work. If what's currently being paid for by the consumers to manage the program is the cost of the program. So it's not a deposit system, and so that would have to be over and above what's already being paid to do the programs. But built into those programs, there are money that are allocated to do public education and public information. So all of those different programs that are currently in place, maybe not in Alberta, but in the rest of the different provinces, they do promote and educate consumers to bring back the material or to bring it to the deposit, the depot places, and so on. So I think, we have to get away from just those types of incentives, which is just a bit like feeding the beast in the municipalities. Then people expect this as a return for doing the right thing. I think they need to learn to do the right thing without the deposit system.
Or perhaps there could be a program that instead of, if there's not a deposit because you're a manufacturer using things that aren't worth returning, there could be the reverse where you would pay a price if you're producing something that has no end life, no value in its end life. Just a thought. Over here.
Hi. I'd like to ask, what is your position on waste-to-energy incineration as part of the whole zero waste or waste management programs?
Well, I want to answer this one as a government member to say that, well, we can, in our personal capacities, we can speak to that. It's important that, because we're in the zero waste room, it's important to make sure that people understand that we've been really careful in setting up the council to make it crystal clear that that's not the piece of waste management that we're going to get into with the Zero Waste Council. The decision as to how you tackle it, whether you're filling it or burning it, is such a highly charged political issue and a very local issue, whether provincially or municipally speaking, that what we felt the greatest role that you could have if you were to put together a group across the country. I noticed that you're wearing an FCM lanyard.
Sorry.
Don't get me started on lanyards. How many people in their professional capacity have a drawer full of lanyards? Are you happier as a result of your collection of lanyards? Do you take them out and look at them? But I noticed that you're from FCM. You'll notice that we never burrow into that issue at FCM either. Because if you did, that membership of 2,500 municipalities quickly blows apart in that discussion of shall we burn it or fill it. So what we've said is whether you're burning it or you're filling it, it's damned expensive. What can we all do together to reduce it?
I might be mistaken, but I thought that maybe Plasco, a company, spoke at FCM at one point, a couple years ago.
Which company spoke? I'm sorry, pardon?
Plasco?
Yes, Plasco, are you saying? Yes, Plasco did, but as a trade envoy, not as a let's open up the debate and decide if we're all going to do this and everything. Vendors that deal with all the processes definitely come and as trade envoys and are on the trade floor, but it still comes back to each municipality has to decide what they're going with. And open up that discussion in your ward and watch the fireworks begin. So to keep this organization having an effect, you want to leave that as a local political decision.
And Shelley, this might be, if you could just briefly talk a little bit about the working groups within the council, because you've got a working group on food waste, product design and packaging, and communications, which I think is really interesting and people want to hear about, because so many of these questions coming through Poll Everywhere and from the floor are about consumer attitudes. So,
well, yes. And the communications one really speaks to the last speaker just before you as well, because one of the things that a lot of the sort of the core municipality in every province ends up shelling out big dough to get the advertising program together. Metro Vancouver, as part of their long-term waste strategy, did the big Make Memories Not Garbage Christmas campaign. You saw it in SkyTrain stations, big budget, really top flight ad company. We did the Chuck and Vince campaign. There are a couple of characters named Chuck and Vince. They're almost Ford-esque, but people love those Chuck and Vince ads. The every guys, big chubby guys talking about reuse, and so those are costly campaigns. Like firms like McLaren's and Taxi. What the National Zero Waste Council is saying is wherever you can take these campaigns and sanitize the name of the city out, put it at the council, and any municipality in Canada can access and use it to educate and communicate reduction in and reuse, in the case of Chuck and Vince, in their community. It's become common property between us by putting it in the communication committee at the council. You can access it for your municipality right now.
another question from the floor, just a few minutes left.
Hey, yeah, so my question is basically, we're talking about billions of dollars for different resources being used, inflows, outflows. But it really, I get some of the anger from some of the speakers regarding consumption. And yeah, we've got a consumption problem. We were born into that society in North America. But I think it's more important, and this is kind of my question, is what is the National Zero Waste Council? What are our municipalities, our provincial levels, our federal levels? What are we doing to get to the kids, to the young people, to the ones that are going to be the consumers of the future? Within our businesses, what we're trying to do is reach schools to get in there and talk about these things. And I think that's a more pressing issue, is how do we reach the next generation? Because if somebody tells me as a business owner to stop driving my truck, I can't stop driving my truck. I'm sorry. I have to do that. I'm creating jobs. I'm helping the economy, and it all works as one. There's ways to address that and change that and reduce our use and reduce our consumption. But really, I think it comes down to the next generations and creating programs on the municipal, the provincial, and the federal level that get in and talk to the kids and really educate the next generation. If someone had told me not to be a consumer at a younger age, I'd probably act a lot different now. But I didn't have that message, and I think it's really important that we start to look at implementing those programs. So just a question to you guys of what we're looking at and how can we address those things for the next generation.
Joanne, wave from the back of the room now. Just wave. See that woman there? Go sign up for the council.
Okay.
Because we don't have that working group yet.
That's
You're
it.
the president.
That was my next question.
Nicely done. All right, sir.
Picking up several of the threads that came up earlier, we all consume because we want to be happy, but fundamentally the issue of recycling is being addressed on the one side in terms of the mechanics of how do we recycle, how do we increase the percentage of recyclable materials, and how do we get it to recycle. On the other hand, we have arguments about carbon taxes and so on, but these are on the fringe. Really what we should be doing if we want to address this in a systemic way is to create a market framework so there is a secondary or a primary market for post-consumer waste. Put prices on it, don't call it a tax. Create it as a marketplace, because once you use the word TAX, all sorts of flags go up. And change people's expectations and not look at something, oh, I don't need this anymore, it must go to the landfill. And rather to think, this has value, I don't need it anymore, I can put it into the marketplace. But there is so much friction, and that marketplace is not working. But if the focus is on creating that marketplace, putting the mechanisms and the framework in place, a lot of those things will solve themselves automatically, because the motivation, the objective function will be present both for the consumer and the manufacturers.
Just one sort of tangible example of something that goes some way towards that idea. I saw one of the questions actually asked was around a company called International Synergies, which runs an industrial symbiosis program. And basically what they mean by that is that within the economy, and to your point as well, Michael, that a lot of the volumes of this waste that exist are often in business-to-business type scenarios in manufacturing supply chains. And what their program does is they will map out where that exists in a kind of ecosystem of businesses, and then they'll look to make up those people who have what is currently waste with those people who may see that as an economic opportunity to create a market opportunity effectively. And they'll actually work as a broker in the middle to, I know this doesn't go
Well, this is like a facilitated market, but I'm talking about going beyond that so that the market is self-running.
Yeah, understand. So I get that, and I think that is a fantastic idea, and we should do that as well. But on this, this idea is real, and it's been run in the UK and parts of Europe very successfully, and I think the guy who runs it was actually here in Globe, and I think that would be a very interesting thing to plug into this program, because it would immediately provide a platform for SMEs and other businesses to start to trade some of this, and the actually mechanism and processes running and tested and peer reviewed and stuff. So it's just one idea.
So a type of waste matchmaking.
Yeah.
Yep.
Who knew this field was so sexy?
Speed dating.
And I think we have two more, and that'll be enough questions from the floor, but we'd like to get you both in.
Jamie Kaminsky from Zero Waste Canada. I just want to say, follow up on the incineration comment, that I think that your group's making a big mistake by not taking a stance, because incinerators are a direct threat to zero waste. They promote consumption, and you have many people in many groups in your organization that are actively building incinerators right now. We have Metro Vancouver, we have Durham Region in Toronto that are looking to build incinerators. Well, Durham Region was approved. So I think that you need to really take a stance, or you're going to be viewed as greenwashing, and nobody's going to take you seriously. That's my comment. My question is, with EPR, if it was doing its job right now, every bottle in the around would be refillable. We wouldn't just be recycling it. We'd be condensing the recyclables and not trucking around air. And also, we wouldn't have burning as an acceptable measure of diversion for EPR. So are you going to be putting pressure on EPR to move up the chain for refillable, repairable, reusable, and also ask the Ministry of Environment to remove incineration out of the hierarchy to say that it's not an acceptable diversion method for EPR programs?
Michael, would you like to take that one?
Nope.
Well, you'll soon
Well,
have to
I'll-
anyway, because there's a giant
Well, you
report
have
about it.
to,
You're
Michael.
soon going to have to.
I'll absolutely deal with the first part. Where I necessarily have to stop is at any specific government's programs. I just hope you'd appreciate that I'm not going to comment on the situation in BC or Ontario or anywhere else. But yeah, on first part of the comment, I have no disagreement at all.
If I could,
So do you think the council should be pushing for an anti-incinerator?
No, I'm
no.
talking about the bottles and about moving up the hierarchy, the 4R hierarchy. In fact, if I remember rightly, we've had a conversation at one of the many meetings in Zero Waste that it's not about recycling, it's about the entire hierarchy, and that we have to move up there. And I think those same conversations are happening right across the country in all sorts of forums, up to and including governments. I don't think anyone is saying it's just a recycling issue.
yeah. But I think that in terms of just the bottles and so on, I think we need to look at it globally, because we're talking about life cycle analysis here as well, because we may be thinking that it's better to use refillable containers, for instance, and I've seen some of those questions asked as well. But when you think about it, maybe in the good old days, there were, you could get those bottled here and there nearby. It was local production, but it's not happening in that fashion anymore. So you're going to be looking at transportation. So maybe we'll be looking at more GHG emissions, So you have to always balance all of these things before we say, sure, it looks simple, let's just refill all of our bottles of pop and whatever, water and things, but it may not always be the right solution. So, and also it has to do with the production. We, unfortunately, maybe, but we don't have as much manufacturing done locally, so so I think this is why it needs to be looked at on a larger scale, and you can't just say it's an automatic good solution.
No, but if you are moving towards that target and you don't have the infrastructure in place, wouldn't that be something that would come from that once there's a criteria to have refillable bottles, or what have you? We can't have a criteria, but you understand when the demand is there, would not lead to the creation of a solution more locally. Drink water instead from your tap.
That could be true as well. But I mean, maybe, but maybe not, because, what is the price to that? And so we go back to the consumers, and I don't want to have this debate, but I think it's just, it's not that as simple as that, and bringing containers to the groceries to fill in and buy your cheese. You can't do that. There are regulations, and so the refillable concept, good. It can work in a lot of places. We see it everywhere here, but maybe it's not adaptable everywhere either, so, yeah.
And our last question from the floor.
Hi, I'm a business student at Simon Fraser University. A common theme that was talked about was waste is a shared responsibility, but it has been argued that there's no such thing as a dumb consumer, as in a consumer that does not know how to dispose of their product. There is only bad design. So if producers design their products for recovery or for the environment, there wouldn't be a waste problem in the first place. I'm just wondering if you could comment on this. Yeah.
Well,
Jamie.
And then I think that's well put. That's all I'll say.
It's and in the end, it will be market driven. There's a gentleman who was saying people want to buy stuff, but in actual fact, we're starting to see the patterns change now. People are buying the smaller home. People are consuming in a different way. When you start moving to the vertical community in the smaller space, we have people buying 3-bedroom condominium units, fully intending to have families in them, and the total unit is 760 square feet. If that family, children and all, Barbies and Transformers and all, is going to live in that place, their buying patterns are going to change. And the way they buy the homes has already changed. The family that bought that condo bought it partly because in an expensive place like Toronto, and we are becoming a very urban nation, they couldn't afford a green single-family dwelling, but under Toronto's new green building standard, they could have a green home if they were willing to live in that small 3-bedroom on the 12th floor. And they actually flipped open the real estate section and looked for the building with the greenest standards. Tridel opened a sales center on one side of the street advertising the Verve, our first ever green standard building with deep lake water cooling and HVAC. And right across the street, they don't mind because they tease each other about all this time, Daniels had a sales center open for the last building to be built before our imposed green standards. They had to shut the sales center down until these guys were done for 2 weeks because no one was coming in their door and it just looked bad. So once the Verve sold out, they reopened up and begged people at a reduced price to buy their homes. The market is driving us to these things, and I think as consumers, if we're going to live in smaller spaces, we're going to start to change the way we buy. But the good news is we are also still growing as a population. So sure, we're going to start playing around with your unit price, and we're going to change your business model a little bit, retailer and manufacturer. But if we are still a growing society, you will find a way to make some money. We just don't want you to do it at that ratio of 80% of it ends up thrown away. As human beings, we don't want that anymore. Yeah.
You know, I think that is a great, very positive, optimistic note to leave our discussion on, that there is some change and people are starting to seek out these more environmentally friendly alternatives. I would like to say thank you so much to all of you for coming this afternoon, and thanks to our panelists, Shelley Carroll, Michael Gores, Jamie Butterworth, and Natalie St. Pierre. We appreciate you spending your time and giving us your insight today. And we're also hoping that what you heard today, if you aren't already involved with the National Zero Waste Council, that you will become involved, because it's really doing some innovative and exciting work, and it's looking for solutions to quite a large problem. You know, if there are opportunities at your business or organization and government ministry, wherever you work, around food waste, packaging, construction, building waste, what have you. We hope that you embrace those opportunities, get engaged with the places where you work, and talk about a little bit about what you heard today, because we all know that the journey of 1,000 miles begins with one less single-use coffee cup. Thanks so much for joining us today.